I'd like to address the 46th objection to the existence of God found on the website godisimaginary.com. This particular objection focuses on Pascal's wager. Pascal lived in the 17th century, and one of the things for which he is famous is his so-called wager experiment, where he asked people who are doubting or who don't know whether or not to accept the Christian faith to consider the consequences of both choices, that if they decide on the one hand to accept Christianity, or if they decide on the other hand to reject God's existence and the truth of Christianity, what will the consequences be? If they decide to say no to Christian faith, the consequence of that might in fact be, if Christianity turns out to be true, it might be that the consequences are eternal. On the other hand, a person who accepts the Christian faith, and let's say it turns out to be false and there is no God, and when you die there's no more of you, then you've lost nothing. Now the assumption of the argument, there are several assumptions of the argument, and by the way I should say that Pascal, but in many people's minds, is defined by this particular argument or this particular line of reasoning. That would be unfair to Pascal. I encourage you to read his writings and his reflections on this subject, especially in his book Points A. If you read that particular book, it's a series of sort of fragmentary writings where he's thinking about various reasons that lead him to faith that are not primarily inspired just by the use of reason to try to establish various arguments for God's existence or something like that. Instead, it's more of an appeal to encounter God in personal terms, and how that might lead a person to faith. In any case, the wager idea of Pascal has become one of the dominant things that stick with him, and it's also become something that atheists like to pick on. As for myself, I don't commonly use Pascal's wager as a way of inviting people into faith. On the other hand, sometimes I do ask students, or when I'm talking about faith, I do talk about the fact that we as human beings seem to be created in such a way, or we find ourselves in such a way, that we must make an existential, self-determining choice about what our life means. On the one hand, we might find ourselves drawn to trust in God and belief that there is some absolute reality, that there is an ultimately personal source of our existence that calls us into a relationship, a meaningful existence that has eternal consequences and eternal significance. On the other hand, there is that pull within us to despair, or that life just might be a cold, empty accident. And so, especially in modern thought, in the last century or so, we've been sort of pulled into a state, especially in Western culture and civilization, where this question is frequently put before us. Is there any ultimate meaning? People talk about postmodernism nowadays, that postmodernism is a kind of cultural and philosophical reaction to the despair that results from the failed modernist project and the Enlightenment project, that the belief that human beings could perfect ourselves, that we could, through our reason and through our use of reason, we could come to know not only the truth of everything, but also we could, through the use of reason, we could perfect ourselves and enter into a utopian world. We could determine the absolute meaning of things, usually in scientific terms they understood it to be. But in the 20th century, it seems as if the optimism of modernism has given way to a much more pessimistic view of the possibilities of human reason. The world wars, the entrance into a state of skepticism and doubt in Western culture, for a variety of different reasons. All of this has led our culture to a state where we're presented a way of thinking that seems to be very despairing and very negative with respect to the possibilities of human life. There's a great deal of anxiety, there are a great deal of psychological disorders that we see popping up and being very common in our culture on a variety of different levels. And so some people conclude from this that human life has no meaning, and the best we can do is medicate ourselves and try to make it through life. On the other hand, you have people, and I include myself in that number, who believe that life does have meaning, and that we should make an existential self-determining choice in the direction of hope. That there is real grounds for hope for us as human beings, not just fabricated hope, not just a hope that is groundless and has no ultimate foundation, but instead as human beings, if we open our eyes wide enough, if we use our minds sharply enough, and if we listen deeply enough to our hearts, I think we'll find that there is this deep call from God to encounter him in love. And the Christian faith, of course, calls us to encounter Christ as God's human face, as God's face in this world, inviting us into a relationship of unending love and friendship, something that we long for on a very, very deep level as human beings. So Pascal's wager is a way of inviting people to consider the consequences of the choices that they make. Now, in this particular argument, this author on the website godizimaginary.com, he criticizes Pascal's wager on several levels. First of all, he says there's thousands of different gods, and therefore we don't know which one to wager on. I think this is an exaggeration. To talk about thousands of different gods, well, maybe if you add up all gods down through the centuries and through history, but if you just take a moment to look online, run a search on the major world religions, and add up the number of people that hold to those various religions in the world, and I think you'll find it's a relatively small handful of religions that people are attracted to in our world, that people find superior to and more attractive and more enduring in their value and depth and satisfying power. I think you'll find that there's a relatively small handful, and even if you take those religions, and usually the list will give you about 15 or 20 different religions in the world, even those can be reduced to a much smaller number when you take the various splinter groups in Eastern religions and the subtle differences, and that they're really sort of psychological or philosophical understandings of the human person. The number of true religions that we find in the world that people find attractive is relatively small. Now, of course, it is true that there are plenty of Christian fragmentations out there, and that creates, I think, an unfortunate division of Christianity that dilutes the effectiveness of our faith. To find Christians disagreeing with each other and splintering off into various different groups, I think is unfortunate. In my view, it's an effect of a principle of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century that is ultimately destructive to the unity of the church. I think there should have been another way that people went about dealing with the challenges that the church faces in terms of corruption and that sort of thing. There are different ways of dealing with corruption. One of those is to splinter away and start one's own group, but that involves compromising and undermining certain important and valuable principles that had been treated as essential to Christian faith for well over 1,000 years. In any case, looking at this from the perspective of how many actual major world religions do we have, it's a relatively small number of them. And I don't think that it's impossible for us to get to the kernel or to the essence of this small number of religions and try to make a judgment about which is fullest and which gives to us the most explanatory power for human life. Obviously, most people aren't going to do that, but we're talking here to people who are wavering and looking for a way forward. And Pascal's wager, I think, gives to us a way forward by calling us to make a choice, a deep choice, about what draws us or most attracts us to give a commitment of our life to it. Atheism has obviously the appeal of bringing certain liberties in this world, perhaps, that one does not want to be bound to certain religious obligations or whatever. But on the other hand, can an atheist truly say, and only the atheist can answer for himself, but can an atheist truly say deep within that atheism truly satisfies on a very deep level, and furthermore, can they truly say that there is no concern and that there's no reason to think that there's anything enduring about the human person beyond this life at all, and therefore human acts have no ultimate consequences or no ultimate self-defining features about them? As a Christian, and as someone who believes very differently from the atheist, I think that the idea that we have an immortal soul, or that our soul will continue to live on beyond this life, is an idea that I find deeply appealing and deeply attractive, not just for biblical reasons, but for a variety of philosophical reasons that I've suggested in other places. And then finally, there's a final observation that I'd like to make about this, and that is whether Pascal's wager is a reasonable way to proceed forth has nothing to do with whether or not God exists. And so whether there are weaknesses with Pascal's particular approach to this, and I think that there are, depending on how we use it, there are some weaknesses in this approach of taking Pascal's wager. Clearly, the only reason why I have to be a Christian is certainly not because I'm afraid of the consequences of not believing the Christian faith. Those are real and meaningful, but typically they are real and meaningful as a preliminary consideration. But after that, I think that most mature Christians will say that their commitment to the Christian faith is not based on fear of the afterlife, but rather it's based on a longing for union with God. It's based on a longing for a deeper relationship to God and a deeper realization or fulfillment of God's work in us and ways that we can contribute to God's work, not because I'm going to be able to get a lot of benefits from it or because I can avoid suffering from it, but rather because I want to become more committed to God and I want to do God's work more fully in this world. But in any case, those are a few thoughts about Pascal's wager. I think it has a limited value, and it certainly is something that occasionally we can stop and step back and reflect on what are the ultimate consequences of the belief system that I have embraced.